The snowstorm swallowed sound in great gusts, but above the forest canopy, a low, mechanical growl broke through, the heavy thump of helicopter blades tearing across the Alaskan sky. Below, the trees swayed, startled by the intrusion. Rangers on snowmobiles wove through the frozen undergrowth, their engines snarling, their rifles clenched tight. Radio chatter crackled between stations, voices tight with urgency. Something enormous had been spotted near the abandoned ranger station. A grizzly. Not just any bear, but one of unnatural size, scarred, deliberate, and moving through the human perimeter with unsettling calm. The last time something like this had happened, the outcome was tragic. Protocols had already been triggered. Evacuation was underway. Fear spread quickly among the ranks. But this bear did not charge. It didn't growl. It didn't flinch at the sound of engines or flashing lights. Instead, it moved with a strange kind of purpose, as though it knew the land better than those sworn to protect it. It followed a path now buried in snow, a trail that hadn't been touched in years, past a signpost long ago knocked down by wind, past the ghost of a fire pit once used by someone who had stayed too long, and past the old ranger cabin that had stood watching over this stretch of wilderness for decades. The bear stopped at the base of a tall spruce, pressed its snout against the bark, and lingered there, quiet, not sniffing for prey, but remembering. Then it lowered itself slowly onto the snow and waited. From the other side of the tree line, a man emerged. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply walked. Each step pressed deep into the snow, the weight of his years bending his frame slightly forward. His uniform was no longer crisp. It looked more like memory than authority. But there was something unmistakable about his presence, the kind of stillness only those who have lost everything learn to carry. He moved toward the bear with bare hands, empty arms, and breath that shook against the cold. He stopped just a few feet away. The chopper light brushed against his face, revealing a weathered expression carved by time and solitude. And then he spoke, just a whisper, lost almost entirely in the wind. The bear turned, and in that frozen stillness, the wild seemed to exhale, not in fear, not in anger, but in a silence so heavy, so ancient, that it could only belong to something sacred finally finding its way home. 2 decades earlier, the Firewatch Tower had been little more than a dot on the map, perched atop a ridge that rose like a spine from the valley floor, surrounded on all sides by an ocean of pine. The wind here rarely rested. It hummed through the trees, whispered across the cabin walls, and filled the silences that men like Eli Whitaker carried inside them. He hadn't been sent here as a punishment. He had chosen it, after the house fire that took his daughter and with it every fragile piece of the life he had tried to hold together. He walked away from the world. His marriage didn't survive the aftermath. Neither did his desire to be anywhere people could find him. So he asked for isolation, and the department gave it to him. His days became rituals. At dawn, he climbed the watchtower and recorded temperatures, wind shifts, and snowfall depths. Midday was for tracking wolves that moved like shadows through the distant glades. At night, he scanned the horizon for campfire smoke, signs of poachers or lost hikers. He wrote in logs, filled charts, answered the occasional check-in call from the station in Anchorage. But most of the time, he didn't speak at all. And when he did, it was to the trees. The forest, in its own strange way, listened. It didn't demand explanations. It didn't bring up the past. It simply let him exist. He lived simply. A wood-burning stove, tin food, a single photograph above the bed, his daughter on her 5th birthday, the last day the world made sense. Some nights he sat by the fire and tried to remember the sound of her voice. Other nights he let the wind fill the space instead. He had no ambition of healing. He wasn't here to recover. He was here because silence was the only thing that didn't hurt. And yet, the forest didn't stay still forever. Seasons shifted. Elk herds returned. Bears emerged from dens. The rhythm of life pulsed even when Eli felt none inside himself. But something in him stirred each time the snow melted. Each spring, when the trees thawed and rivers broke open, he would hike a little farther, look a little longer. He didn't know what he was searching for. Maybe a reason to still be here. Maybe just distraction. But on one such morning, as the sun peeled frost from the canopy and the air was heavy with meltwater and moss. Something changed. He heard a sound he hadn't heard before. Not the crack of branches, not the call of birds, but something softer. A cry. Weak, fragile, not human, but desperate all the same. He followed it through the thicket, boots crunching against wet soil, pulse rising with a tension he didn't understand yet. The trees parted around a clearing, and there, nestled in the brush beside a lifeless mound of fur and blood, was a grizzly cub. Alone, trembling, and looking straight at him. That was the moment the silence broke. The morning had started like any other, mist curling up from the river's surface, birdsong fractured by the occasional cracking of ice beneath the thawing earth. Eli moved along the riverbank with the quiet familiarity of someone who had walked the same trail for years. His boots pressed into the softened mud, leaving deep prints that would vanish by evening. He was logging beaver activity near the water's edge when he heard it. Faint at first, almost mistaken for the cry of a hawk. But it came again. Short, weak, raw. He stopped. It wasn't the sound of a bird, and it wasn't the wind either. It was broken, fragmented in the way only real suffering could be. A cry of something too small to defend itself, too lost to understand its own fear. The sound drew him off trail, deeper into a grove of spruce where sunlight rarely touched the ground. The air grew heavy, damp. The scent of blood drifted just beneath the moss and pine. Then he saw it. A patch of earth, torn apart and darkened with rot. A body, massive and still, slumped over the forest floor. The mother. Her chest was riddled with bullet wounds, the angle suggesting it hadn't been a clean kill. Likely a poacher, careless and fast. Left to rot. And beside her, pressed against her lifeless body, as if clinging to warmth that no longer existed, was a cub. So small it barely looked real. Its fur was matted, its nose crusted with dirt and frost, and its body shook with each uneven breath. One of its eyes was half closed, crusted from cold and infection. It didn't run when Eli stepped closer. It didn't even flinch. It just stared up at him with eyes too big for its body, eyes that held nothing but confusion and grief. Eli's chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years. He knew what the rulebook said. Let nature run its course. Don't interfere. Don't humanize the wild. But this wasn't nature. This was the consequence of someone else's cruelty. This was abandonment wrapped in fur and fear. And when the cub let out another whimper, soft, almost apologetic, Eli's resolve broke. He dropped to one knee, slipped off his jacket, and gently wrapped the tiny body inside it. The cub didn't fight. It didn't protest. It simply sank into the warmth, its trembling slowing just enough to let out a quiet sigh. Eli carried him all the way back to the station, arms tight around the fragile bundle. That night, he fed him goat's milk with a medicine dropper and tucked him into a basket lined with wool blankets. The cub's breathing steadied, its eyes closed. Eli sat beside him until morning. He named him Kodiak, not just for the species, but for strength, for survival, for something that might one day rise from loss and live. Eli had spent his entire life respecting the boundaries between man and wild, but nothing in his ranger training had prepared him for the delicate weight of a bear cub in his arms or the quiet way it trusted him with its fragile life. There was no manual, no guideline, no backup team stationed nearby. Just a man, a cub, and a vast wilderness that rarely offered second chances. He started small, warming goat's milk on the stove, feeding Kodiak with a dropper at first, then with a small bowl. The cub's appetite grew by the day, and with it, his strength. The first few weeks were cautious. Eli built a makeshift den beneath the firewatch tower, insulating it with old blankets and cedar branches to keep Kodiak warm during the long, frigid nights. Every morning, the cub would crawl out, wobbling on unsteady legs, but determined to follow Eli wherever he went. It didn't take long before those shaky steps turned to confident strides. Kodiak became Eli's silent companion on patrols, always at his heels, occasionally distracted by a beetle in the grass or the rustle of a rabbit in the brush. Winter passed, and spring returned with bursts of green, and so did playfulness. Kodiak would roll through snowbanks, wrestle with fallen logs, and chase leaves with a giddy kind of clumsiness that made Eli laugh for the first time in years. At night, the cub would nuzzle into Eli's chest and fall asleep to the rhythm of a heart that slowly had begun to remember how to care again. Eli knew the forest was no place for a tame bear, so he began building a small fenced clearing not far from the cabin. Inside it, Kodiak could dig, climb, and explore under the safety of Eli's watch. He learned to forage, to paw at termite mounds, to catch trout in the stream that ran cold even in summer. They swam together in the glacial waters when the heat became unbearable, and on crisp evenings, they sat by the fire, one man, one bear, and a silence that no longer felt empty. Days turned to months. Kodiak grew, shedding the softness of a cub and revealing the muscle and size of a creature meant to rule the wild. But despite the growing distance between their species, the bond didn't fade. It deepened. Where Eli once saw reminders of all he had lost, he now saw a presence that asked for nothing but offered everything. It wasn't healing in the way people talked about. It didn't erase grief, but it gave him something new. Not closure, not escape, just a reason to wake up each morning. And that, in the heart of the forest, was enough. As Kodiak grew into adolescence, the world around the cabin could no longer contain him or hide him. His size had become impossible to ignore, his presence undeniable. Hikers passing through nearby trails began to report sightings. Stories surfaced of a bear that didn't flee, that watched with calm curiosity instead of fear. Some dismissed it as myth. Others warned of danger. Word traveled quickly in the ranger network, and it wasn't long before it reached the desks of those who followed rules written in ink, not memory. One late summer afternoon, a government vehicle arrived, tires crunching over gravel that hadn't been touched by official wheels in years. The man who stepped out wore a badge and a look of quiet disdain. He didn't ask questions. He issued commands. A bear, no matter how gentle, was not meant to share space with a man. Not like this. He demanded Kodiak be transferred immediately to a wildlife sanctuary hundreds of miles away. A secure, contained facility where the state could oversee what it called rehabilitation. Eli tried to explain. Kodiak wasn't a threat. He knew Eli's voice. He understood boundaries. He had never harmed a soul. But policies don't bend for personal bonds. Compassion was not listed in the wildlife management guidelines. The inspector listened with arms folded and eyes unmoved, then left behind a single ultimatum: release the bear or face criminal charges. There would be no appeal. Eli didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch in silence, Kodiak curled at his feet, unaware of what was coming. The forest felt different, colder, distant, as if it too sensed the unraveling. When dawn broke, pale and reluctant, Eli rose and packed a small bag. He didn't leash Kodiak. He didn't coax or drag. He simply started walking, and the bear followed. They hiked for hours, deeper into the wild than Eli had ever dared venture. Snow clung to the mountain ridges, and wind hissed through the branches like an omen. At the edge of a narrow pass where the trees opened to a wide, sloping valley, Eli stopped. He turned to Kodiak. The bear stood tall, dusted with frost, eyes calm and waiting. Eli dropped to one knee and placed his hand on the creature's chest. No words would ever be enough, but he whispered goodbye anyway. Kodiak didn't resist. He looked back once, just once, then turned and walked into the trees. That moment didn't just mark a separation. It carved a wound in Eli that no season could erase. Letting go of Kodiak was not the hardest thing he had done. It was the cruelest thing he had been forced to survive. The forest did not mourn loudly. It simply grew quieter. After Kodiak's departure, the Firewatch Tower stood taller than before, not in pride, but in emptiness. The rhythm that had once defined Eli's days, the shuffling of paws against the floorboards, the soft grunts of curiosity, the shared breath at sunrise, was gone. In its place came a silence that wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. The patrols continued, but without purpose. Eli still tracked snowfall, still recorded sightings of eagles and caribou, still climbed the ladder each morning with his thermos in hand. But the forest felt changed. Not in the way trees shift with seasons, but in the way a house feels after a loved one is gone. It echoed with a presence that had once filled it so completely, now replaced only by the ache of memory. Sometimes, in the stillness of early morning, He would hear something. Faint steps on the porch, the creak of a log shifting under weight. His heart would leap before his mind caught up, and he would rush to the door, only to find snow piled against the steps, wind carving trails where he had imagined paws. And at night, the dreams came. Kodiak, older, wandering through a storm. Alone. Searching. The bear would always turn back to look at him, eyes unreadable, and then vanish into the darkness before Eli could reach out. Years passed. Gray crept into his beard, and the joints in his hands stiffened with the cold. The forest began to outpace him. Trails that were once familiar grew harder to climb. He knew when it was time. With quiet hands and heavier steps, Eli packed his few belongings, journals, field notes, the photo of his daughter that had yellowed at the corners, and locked the cabin door one final time. He left the forest behind and moved to a small cabin near town, closer to people but further from peace. Still, he never stopped looking. On clear days, he'd sit on the porch with a pair of old binoculars, scanning the ridge line, watching the shifting shadows between the trees, always wondering, had Kodiak survived? Had he found his own kind? Did he remember the warmth of the den, the feel of a hand on his shoulder, the voice that had once whispered him to sleep? Eli didn't need answers, just the hope that somewhere out there, a bear still walked the forest with the memory of a man etched into his heart. 15 winters had come and gone since Eli last walked the path that led to the ridge. The forest had grown wilder in his absence. The younger rangers who now watched over the territory worked with drones and satellite tags, tools that Eli never learned to trust. But something had stirred among their reports, something strange enough to cut through layers of time and memory. A massive grizzly had been sighted near one of the oldest cabin sites in the reserve. No attacks, no aggression, just a pattern. The same stones marked with fresh scent, the same trees clawed not with violence, but ritual. Circling, sitting, observing. Rangers flagged it as abnormal behavior. Some feared it was the beginning of territorial aggression. Others shrugged it off as coincidence. But it kept happening. Over 5 weeks, the same bear returned again and again. Each time, its movements pulled tighter around one specific site, a forgotten post deep in the forest, long since decommissioned. The same one where Kodiak had taken his first steps. When the call came, Eli didn't hesitate. His body was weaker, slower, but the pull of the forest still knew his name. He packed little. Just a worn coat, a map he no longer needed, and a pair of boots that still remembered the trail. The journey back was quiet. The new rangers didn't say much, only that something about this bear felt different. They dropped him near the edge of the clearing and let him go on alone. The old cabin barely stood. The roof had caved in, moss covered the logs, and wind moved freely through broken slats. But the place still breathed with memory. Eli stepped over the threshold, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't for years. Then he saw them. In the fresh snow near the steps were prints, massive, deliberate, unmistakably bear. But not just any bear. The spacing was familiar. The depth, the way the front paws dragged ever so slightly at the toes, just like they had when Kodiak was a cub, still learning to balance his weight. Eli knelt beside them, his hand trembling as he hovered it over the impression. The snow was still warm beneath the top layer. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the tree where they used to rest, listening to the wind move through the branches. And when dawn broke and the frost clung to the needles and silver threads, he heard it, the slow, heavy crack of branches. A shadow shifted in the tree-line. Then a shape emerged, massive, for thick with age, shoulders wide, eyes dark and watching. Scars crossed its side like trails of memory carved by time. It moved forward, steady and slow, until it stood just beyond the clearing. Eli stood too, breath caught in his chest. The bear stared at him, and in its stillness, in its silence, he knew. Kodiak had come home. What happened next silenced the forest in a way no wind or snowfall ever could. Kodiak took slow, deliberate steps toward the man who had once carried him in the folds of a wool jacket. The massive grizzly, a creature built by the wild and weathered by time, paused just a few feet from Eli. The air was thick with tension, not because of fear, but because something was unfolding that defied everything the textbooks had ever written. The younger rangers who had followed Eli kept their distance, their hands near tranquilizers, breath held tightly between clenched jaws. No one spoke. No one moved. They had prepared for a wild animal, not a reunion. Kodiak stopped in front of Eli. For a moment, his chest rose in a deep breath, and then he exhaled, not with a growl or warning, but something softer, like a sigh from somewhere far deeper than lungs. Then he bowed his head, slowly, as if returning to a place that had waited patiently for years. His massive body lowered gently to the ground, the snow settling around him. His eyes never left Eli's, and Eli, trembling but unafraid, lowered himself to the forest floor beside him. The years that had stiffened his knees and thinned his frame didn't matter. He sat down in the snow like he had so many times before, and without a word, reached out and laid his weathered hand on Kodiak's shoulder. There were no commands, no tethers, no barriers between species. Just two beings, bound not by control, but by something wordless, something that had survived 15 years of separation, storms, and silence. The cameras from a distance caught the moment. It made the news. Wildlife specialists tried to explain it. Some spoke of imprinting, others of conditioned response, but none could agree. What happened there didn't belong in charts or equations. Those who witnessed it, who saw the way Kodiak leaned into the touch, and how Eli's eyes filled without a sound, understood something deeper. This wasn't instinct. It was memory. It was trust. It was a kind of love the wild rarely shows, and humans often forget. It needed no translation, only presence. The footage of the old ranger and the returning bear spread like wildfire. What was meant to be a quiet patrol deep in the wilderness became a story that ignited hearts across the world. News outlets replayed the moment again and again. A grizzly bear, fully grown and wild, laying down beside the man who had once raised him. It touched something ancient in people, something beyond science and spectacle. Donations poured in. Letters arrived from children, from biologists, from strangers who simply wanted to believe that memory could outlast separation. Conservationists saw an opportunity, not for fame, but for change. They petitioned fiercely, arguing that Kodiak wasn't to be caged or displayed but protected. He had found his way home. He had chosen it, and he deserved to live there without fences. The government agreed, not out of obligation, but because public demand made it impossible to ignore. The forest where Kodiak had once grown from cub to bear was declared a sanctuary zone, untouched, uncommercialized, and deeply sacred. Eli remained at the heart of it all. Though age had slowed him, it had not dulled his passion. He began mentoring the next generation of rangers, not just with field skills or wildlife protocol, but with a quieter, deeper understanding. He taught them how to listen, not just to sounds, but to silences. He spoke of how animals remember, how they mourn, how they love in ways that don't always look familiar, but are no less real. Kodiak stayed close to the cabin clearing. Despite miles of open territory, he rarely strayed far. He returned often to the old porch, now reinforced but unchanged, lying in the same patch of sunlight he had known as a cub. The bond hadn't faded with time. It had only matured into something more unspoken, more profound. The sanctuary was never open to tourists. That was a line Eli never allowed to be crossed. Only researchers, conservation students, and those who approached with humility were welcomed. They came not to take photos, but to witness, to sit among the trees and feel what still lingered there. The forest no longer belonged to just nature or man. It had become a living story, a testament to connection, to memory, to a love that chose not to forget. The years moved gently over the sanctuary, as if time itself had learned to tread softly in that part of the forest. Eli grew older, slower, more fragile with each passing season. The younger rangers had taken over most of the duties, but his presence remained a quiet cornerstone of the place. His stories, his patience, his quiet reverence woven into every path, every tree. When his body began to fail and breath became a careful effort, Eli made one final request. He wanted to return to the clearing, just once more, to the place where everything that mattered had begun and ended. The snow fell in soft flakes that morning, covering the trail like a blanket made of memory. Two rangers wheeled him gently through the woods, their voices low, their pace unhurried. The forest was silent, as if it too was waiting. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tall spruce where Eli had once said goodbye, the branches rustled, not with alarm, not with panic, but with recognition. Kodiak stepped through the trees. He was older now. His coat carried streaks of silver, and his movement bore the weight of years spent in the wild. But his eyes, steady, deep, and filled with something eternal, had not changed. He walked to Eli, without hesitation, each step slow and sure, and then lowered himself beside the man who had once given him life. No words were exchanged. There never had been. They stayed there together, the old man and the old bear, as the sun dipped behind the snow-draped mountains and painted the sky in amber silence. Eli passed away a few weeks later, surrounded by those who loved him, but not before smiling one last time, with the memory of Kodiak beside him and the forest holding them both. In a world governed by laws, by instincts, by the unspoken boundaries between human and wild, there are still moments that defy everything we think we know. Moments that remind us that love does not ask for permission, and memory does not fade just because time tells it to. Eli never came to the forest to raise a bear, and Kodiak, lost and trembling beside his mother's lifeless body, never asked for a guardian. But grief does strange things. It breaks us open. And sometimes, in that brokenness, two souls find each other and rebuild something neither one was looking for. The forest remains as it always was, vast, unforgiving, untamed. But somewhere within it, in a small clearing where moss grows thick and snow falls quietly, something different endures, something softer. The old cabin still stands in pieces, weathered by seasons, and Kodiak still returns. Rangers speak of how he walks the perimeter with quiet purpose, how he pauses by the old porch, and sometimes lies where the fire pit once glowed. No one calls him, no one feeds him, but he comes. Maybe he's waiting, or maybe he's just remembering, because in the end, the truest forms of love leave no scars, no leash marks, no echoes of control. They live in the silence, in the spaces between footfalls and heartbeat, in the quiet that follows a name once spoken in trust. Love in the wild doesn't roar. It remembers. It always remembers. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you real stories from the wilderness, where the lines between human and nature blur, where instinct meets emotion, and where silence says more than words ever could. Every like, comment, and share helps us keep these untold stories alive. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and never stop believing in the quiet power of connection.